Good evening. I apologize for the slight delay. It's Diane Sayre, and this is the New York Symposium. We were having some technical issues which have been somewhat resolved. So today's June 28th, and I just saw a short article written by Scott Ritter comparing democracy in the United States and in Iran, where they had elections today. Their constitution mandates that within 50 days of the death of their president, that they hold elections. And he described the process as being very dignified and rational, with 6 candidates who participated in, I forget how many debates over a few weeks. 2 of them dropped out. The voters are now choosing from 4. And then he compared that to the spectacle which we saw last night, where we have a sitting president who clearly is suffering from dementia, Donald Trump, who is a reality TV star, and then Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's not allowed to participate. And it's really just a sham. Now, for people who saw the debate, it's being widely admitted that the point of having the debate so early was so the Democratic Party could decide whether or not they were going to dump Joe Biden and bring in some other candidate. I do have to say that this is a complete violation of democratic proceedings, since many states have already had their Democratic presidential primaries. And what it means is that the voters of every state are deprived by the Democratic National Committee of the opportunity to vote for a presidential candidate of their choice, but it will be dictated by the money bag warmongers, and I should say whoremongers, at the national convention. This just makes a mockery of the whole process. And under the Biden administration, we are the nation running around the planet bludgeoning people in the name of democracy. And I think in part to keep up that image, we were probably forced in some way to make conditions for the release of Julian Assange. And unlike some, I do not blame him for accepting the plea deal. I think it's outrageous that he was made to plead guilty to a non-existent crime under the Espionage Act, which I still don't really understand how that applies to a non-American, and certainly shouldn't apply to a journalist. But at any rate, he is out of prison, recuperating from a very stressful ordeal. His wife, Stella, has requested privacy and assures everyone that he will be making a public comment after he's had some time to recover. Otherwise, I have released a statement on why the United States should accept President Putin's proposal for negotiations for peace, starting on the terms that he outlined in his speech to the Russian Foreign Ministry on June 14th. And I will just say that he has not had such a meeting since December or November. Actually, he had such a meeting in November of 2021. So he has not had such a meeting with his foreign ministry for 3 years almost, November of 2021. And therefore, you might consider the seriousness with which this was developed. After the meeting in 2021, Putin offered 3 different treaty proposals, which had to do with Ukraine remaining neutral, Ukraine not joining NATO, and his insistence that Russia could not tolerate ethnic cleansing in the Donbass. That meant that Biden, Boris Johnson, then Prime Minister of the UK, and NATO all knew that they could provoke Putin to take action if they threatened ethnic cleansing against that population. And sure enough, the Ukrainian forces, armed and intermingled with a bunch of neo-Nazis like the Azov regiments massed on the line of contact between the Donbass and Ukraine. It was clear they were going to go in and commit a massive atrocities, and so therefore Putin acted. And it was a special military operation, and with only about 6 weeks after that, Zelensky and Putin were very, very close to negotiating an end to the conflict in Turkey, and Boris Johnson hopped on his plane, flew over there to sabotage it and make sure the US could continue, the US, UK, et cetera, could continue arming Ukraine to continue the war. That war has now been lost by Ukraine. They are not going to win, no matter how many weapons we send, no matter how many American troops we send, which is now being discussed in the form of military advisors. We heard that before Vietnam. It's not going to change the outcome of the war, except it may push us over the cliff to a thermonuclear war of annihilation. That's where I hope we don't go. So you might say, with all of this going on in the world, why are you holding a symposium to discuss the question of thermonuclear fusion? And I think the only way that you can get out of a mess is you have to have in your mind where mankind is going. Where should we be going? What would be the basis for cooperation between the United States and Russia, between the United States and China, and the great virtue of our nation being filled with people who have different religions, different languages, and different histories, is that when you have a really, really difficult problem that you're trying to solve, it sometimes can be beneficial to have people looking at it from slightly different angles, people who have slightly different insights, who can triangulate, if you will, to solve the problem. And I saw just last week, the US Senate passed a bill to encourage the development of nuclear power. It includes also some more funding for fusion, but the development not only of small modular reactors, but also the most advanced prototypes of fission reactors, trying to eliminate some of the bureaucratic red tape and get us on the way to having sufficient electricity, which is the big question at the moment. So with that introduction, we will first go to my friend Joel DeJean, who is a former congressional candidate in Texas, worked for Texas Instruments, engineering and science background, and who has been quite an advocate for thermonuclear fusion energy over the years and is very up on the latest developments. So I wanted him to share with us what's happening and the potential. And then we're joined also by Megan Beets of Lyndon LaRouche's science team. And also, I have to say, with the LaRouche Legacy Foundation, doing brilliant work on getting LaRouche's writings out and available to the public. So Joel, please go ahead, and glad to have you here.
I apologize for the delay, but I'll just go right ahead. Until the early morning of December 5th, 2022, the only places in the entire universe that have had thermonuclear fusion, sustained thermonuclear fusion reactions, are stars like our sun and all the stars in the galaxies and all the stars in the entire universe. The other place has been during the testing of thermonuclear weapons. Now, on December 5th in 2022, the National Ignition Facility, which is part of the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, conducted a test using the most powerful laser in the world with 192 laser beams striking a hole room or a chamber holding a small tablet a few millimeters in thickness it hit that tablet, that whole room, with over 2 million joules of energy, laser energy, and the output from that shot was 3.15 megajoules or million joules. For the first time anywhere on Earth, a controlled fusion reaction achieved ignition. Now, that was the first shot. Over the last 18 months, they have had 4 additional ignitions. One on July 30th of 2023, 2 in October of 2023, and the most recent being February 12th of 2024, where they upped the energy of the laser. The incoming energy was 2.2 million joules, and the output was 5.2 megajoules, over twice what the input was. Now, why the National Ignition Facility? Well, we have to go back to the creation of the Lawrence Livermore National Lab. It was created in 1952 by Ernest Lawrence and Edward Teller, 2 veterans of the Manhattan Project, and its mission was both to be in competition with the other weapons lab, Los Alamos, which had designed the atomic bombs, and to design the new, what was known then as the H-bomb. Now, the first test of the H-bomb occurred on the 1st of November in 1952, and it used a fission bomb as a trigger to generate thermonuclear fusion. The fission bomb was about 10,000 tons equivalent of TNT. The yield on the hydrogen bomb was almost 1,000 times more than the fission bomb. So within 9 months, the Soviet Union conducted their first test of a thermonuclear device. So the race was on. Now, in 1955, you had Edward Teller recruited a young physicist from Columbia University called John Knuckles. And his mission was, 1, to design smaller thermonuclear warheads that could fit on top of a missile, either intercontinental ballistic missile or a submarine-launched ballistic missile, which was developed. But his second goal was to figure out a way to turn this massive release of energy into something that could be useful for mankind. So it was called Operation Plowshares. So we had the sword, we had the nuclear sword, the Russians had the nuclear sword. We held them over each other's heads. We had the Cuban Missile Crisis. But in 1960, a new device was invented called the laser, which is an acronym for the light amplification by stimulated emissions of radiation. Now, what Knuckles tried to do is he used a smaller fission bomb to generate the thermonuclear explosion, and his first idea was to contain this within salt caverns and try to extract the energy there. The only problem was there's a certain limit to how small you can get the fission device. So when the laser came along in 1960, he reasoned that if we had a powerful enough laser, it could substitute for the fission bomb and provide the containment, the compression, and the heat to generate a thermonuclear reaction. Now, it took 60 years. From the first lasers, they increased the energy output, they changed the design, so So in 1997, they decided to build the National Ignition Facility with the goal of achieving what they call scientific break-even, where you're not talking about the efficiency of the laser, you're talking about the input energy of the laser into the target, and you measure what the output of that target undergoing fusion is. And it took 60 years. Now, the other mission of the National Ignition Facility is to recreate the conditions occurring in the core of suns, stars, large planets, and the conditions occurring during a thermonuclear weapons explosion. So in 1992, when we stopped underground tests, we had already stopped atmospheric tests of H-bombs in 1963 with Kennedy and Khrushchev. They decided, the US and Russia had an informal agreement to stop underground testing. So they were going to use the National Ignition Facility to maintain the stockpile. But the other mission of the National Ignition Facility was to provide the necessary inputs to achieve inertial confinement fusion. And that was done. Now, the funding, because it was a defense program, the funding was maintained while the other magnetic fusion programs were severely cut throughout the 90s. And they started building the facility in the 2000s. They completed it in 2010. The first shots occurred in 2011, and they were surprised that their output was only 1,000 joules, so about 1,000 times less than what they expected. So over the last 11 years until 2022, they refined the output of the laser. They refined the targets, because what happens when the laser strikes the inside of the hohlraum chamber that holds the target, it bathes the tablet size, few millimeter in diameter tablet with X-rays. And the idea is it has to implode symmetrically in order to trigger the fusion. Well, they did all their refinements, and they achieved success of December the 5th of 2022, and they have repeated it 4 times. Now, it's been said that the first ignition was equivalent to the Wright brothers' first powered flight in 1903 in Kitty Hawk. So obviously, this scientific laboratory test is not a prototype or a fusion reactor. So last December of 2023, the Department of Energy announced a $42 million program funding 3 hubs to research into more efficient lasers using diode pump lasers, where instead of efficiency of less than 1%, you go up to over 20% efficiency from the wall or from your power grid. And also, they're looking into mass producing targets so that instead of 1 shot a day, which has been the norm over the years at the National Ignition Facility, they would have 10 shots a second to produce a real usable prototype fusion reactor. Now, we are nowhere close to getting there. The $42 million are little baby steps. But if you think of the Wright brothers again, in 1903, within 24 years, Charles Lindbergh was flying not just a few hundred feet or a few seconds. He flew 33 hours from Long Island, New York to the Bourget Airfield in Paris, 3,600 miles. And this was the first time that there was a nonstop crossing of the Atlantic. Within 20 years of that flight, Chuck Yeager, using a specialized rocket plane, was the first person to go beyond the sound And within 22 years of that feat, Neil Armstrong was walking on the moon. So once a breakthrough is achieved, the scientific principle is understood, then you can devote the resources to increase your efficiency, increase your capabilities. And I'm sure that if we have a crash program like what Lyndon LaRouche calls for in his fourth law, and not just $42 million for some research, and one of the hubs is there in New York at the University of Rochester. So if we, instead of sending $60 billion to Ukraine to slaughter their youth, if we use some of that money for a crash program for fusion research, we can get there within a decade or two at the most. Now, at the same time, has been great progress in the magnetic fusion program, but I won't go through that right now. I'll just see if Diane has questions and see if Megan could fill in any holes that I've left.
Sure. Megan, why don't we just go to you right away? Oh, you're muted, or we can't hear you.
Okay, is that better?
Yes, you're a little faint, but we can hear you.
Okay. One more thing. Okay, maybe that helps a little bit.
Yes, very much.
Good. So listening to what Joel outlined, especially your conclusion, Joel, when you called for a crash program, you look at what humanity is able to do when we organize our efforts with an intention for progress, which is fueled by the inspiration of seeing that we as a species are able to make discoveries of things that you can't see or taste or touch, namely new, true universal principles. And we embody those principles in machines and machine tools and instruments like the laser fusion apparatus that Joel was describing. I think raises the essential question of economics, of statecraft, of everything, which is, what is the human species? What are we as a species? What are we here for? What's our assigned role in this developing universe? Today, the world population is 8 billion people, maybe a little more. It's around 8 billion. And the rough estimate is that by 2050, assuming we have no nuclear war, by 2050, the world population is projected to be 9.7 billion people. It was in 1804 that the human population reached 1 billion for the first time. 1927, we doubled that to 2 billion. So it took all of human history to get the population to 1 billion. And it took 123 years to double it to 2 billion. Now we have 8. No animal species can do that. And that's purely due to the cognitive, creative, passionate powers of the human mind. It's a beautiful thing. And frankly, we should have many more than 8 billion today. If we return to sanity and pursue the kinds of things that Joel was outlining, we should have the idea that we're going to have 25 to 50 billion people on the planet within a century. And that might even be a low estimate. And that's how, as a country, that's how the United States was thinking coming out of World War II. A lot of people don't realize that in the US, we had a classified, small scale, but a classified crash program for nuclear fusion in the 1950s. It was called Project Sherwood, and it was run out of the weapons labs that Joel was describing, what became Los Alamos, Lawrence Livermore, Oak Ridge, and so on. And it was these scientists who were passionate about taking these fundamental discoveries and applying them to liberate mankind from poverty forever. And actually, I wanted to read quickly a quotation from the head of the Atomic Energy Commission. In 1954, he was the head of this Project Sherwood, Lewis L. Strauss. He said about fusion, "Our children will enjoy in their homes electrical energy too cheap to meter. It's not too much to expect that our children will know of great periodic regional famines in the world only as matters of history. They will travel effortlessly over the seas and under them, and through the air with a minimum of danger and at great speeds. And they will experience a lifespan far longer than ours as disease yields and man comes to understand what causes him to age. And that was the outlook of the achievement of the breakthrough of fusion. In the US, especially in the magnetic confinement, which is just a different approach to achieving fusion, where we heat very light atoms of helium and hydrogen to extremely high temperatures until it becomes a plasma, which is a state of matter that could melt any physical material. And so the walls of these fusion experimental machines are magnetized, and we contain this hot plasma with magnets rather than with the lasers impinging upon the fusion fuel. We made incredible progress in magnetic confinement fusion to the point that the Congress passed a bill in 1979, led by Mike McCormick, who was a congressman from Washington State, working with the Fusion Energy Foundation that LaRouche founded, passed a bill called the 1980 Magnetic Fusion Engineering Act to allocate funds to set up engineering facilities to prepare to implement fusion power all across the United States. But it wasn't funded. It was signed into law by Jimmy Carter, and it wasn't funded. It never came to be. So the head of one of the heads of the offices in the Department of Energy, who had helped make all these wonderful breakthroughs happen, when he heard that this program was basically being canceled, he said, and I think this is important for us thinking about why you need a crash program, you need something from the level of government and international agreements. He said, his name was Ed Kintner. He said, the cancellation of this program leaves the fusion program without a strategic backbone. It is a collection of individual projects and activities without a defined mission or timetable. The plan to increase industry involvement in fusion and fusion development is postponed indefinitely, and the industrial and economic benefits of high technology spin-offs, surely an increasingly important byproduct of an accelerated fusion technology program, will be lost. And he was right. But I just bring that up because it points to the fact that we have to have a recommitment to human progress, which, Diane, is what you brought up at the beginning. You have to have a vision of where we have to go and the leadership to commit to that. You also brought up, Diane, the question of on what basis will we be able to collaborate with Russia and with China. China has this incredible fusion program. Russia also has incredible work, but China's really made wonderful breakthroughs in their fusion program. They have a tokamak called the East Tokamak, where they've sustained a plasma of 100 million degrees centigrade. Just for some perspective, the center of the sun is 15 million degrees. So this little machine on planet Earth has sustained a plasma of 100 million degrees for over 100 seconds. So that's what makes us human. And that's a basis on which we can all collaborate. And I can only echo what Joel alluded to in the idea of turning our swords into plowshares. So that's what I'd add for now.
Great. Well, I would like to hear from both of you. I know Lyndon LaRouche worked a great deal on the relationship between energy and economy. And I will say one of the things I listened to part of Bobby Kennedy's debate. As I mentioned, they wouldn't include him in the debate, so he held his own. And while being very lucid and clear about the Ukraine-Russia situation, he was quite off the mark in his discussion of energy. He was talking about that we basically want to eliminate ultimately fossil fuels, and that every house will be its own generator. I don't know if that means solar panels, windmills, riding your bicycle in a treadmill, or what he's talking about. But this simply will not work. This will not work to sustain what you're talking about, Megan. And as people may know, I have said repeatedly, the United States needs to have 1 billion people, and we have to build infrastructure for that. And I'm not talking about, the migrant situation that also should be alleviated. And if we were building what we needed, we need a lot more skilled workers. But Joel, thoughts on this question of the relationship of energy? Why is this important? Why should we develop fusion?
Well, just to paraphrase John F. Kennedy, just on the temperature, that 15 million degrees C is almost as hot as it used to today. But that's just an aside. But the reason is you look at a country like Niger. Niger is the main source of uranium, not for itself. Only 3% of Niger, citizens of Niger, have electricity. And you look at my home country, Haiti, 90% now of people have no access to electricity. They survive by cutting down mango trees, cutting down shrubs, converting these wood implements to charcoal, and they use charcoal as 75% of their energy source. So if you look at the history of man, we started out with just human labor, about 100 watts per human. We graduated to using animal power. A horsepower is about 800 watts. Then we discovered not just charcoal, but we discovered coal. And we used coal for the steam engine, which gave us the capability to have locomotives for transportation. But you can't put a steam motor on an airplane. So we discovered petroleum, especially here in Texas. We discovered natural gas, which has twice the energy per kilogram of coal. With these liquid fuels and these gaseous fuels, we're able to extend our reach to have things like airplanes, jets, rockets. And now that we have fossil fuels, which has been the major reason why we went from 1 billion to 8 billion, is because of the use of fossil fuels. But we can't just keep using the same technology that we've been using for 100 years. We have to go to fission, nuclear, and fusion. And if we look at what the Chinese just did with the return from the far side of the moon with samples, I'd like to get some of those, a few grams of those samples to see how much helium-3 is on the far side compared with the near side. Because the next fuel after deuterium and tritium is helium-3.
Yeah, Megan? Yeah, I was just going to start in the same place Joel did, because I had earlier quickly looked up some numbers on energy poverty. I didn't have time to go in depth, but it's estimated that somewhere between 2 and 3 billion people around the world are in energy poverty, meaning that they don't either have no access to electricity or don't have access to enough energy to make a difference in their quality of life, which is for 2024 is just unfathomable. The amount of people, the number of people who do not have access to electricity for the first time in, I guess, since the mid-20th century is going up. So more people this year have no access to electricity than last year. So But on the flip side, you look at, I don't want to repeat what Joel said, but just to bring up something that's important to understanding LaRouche's science of physical economy and why a healthy economy is actually an anti-entropic economy that can be measured by whether or not the rate of growth of the potential population density is increasing is something called the productive powers of labor. The most efficient way, and at times the only way to increase the productive powers of labor, meaning freeing mankind from the kinds of labor that Joel was describing in our early existence, such that we have free energy to invest into new discoveries, into cultural pursuits and so forth, is applying denser and denser forms of power. Joel was citing the mere grams of fusion fuel that can be found in the lunar soil. Just a few grams can power just as much as, I forget the numbers now, but it's many, 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 many tons of coal and so forth. But the other side of it is not just the electricity and sheer energy in that sense, but by applying more and more dense forms of power, we actually gain a greater mastery over materials and over other things in the physical world. With fusion, we can manipulate the atomic properties of matter and basically make designer atoms. This has incredible.
Does that mean we can make diamonds out of coal?
Precisely. But we can tailor.
That's better than the Federal Reserve printing money.
Yeah, right. If only they would do this, right?
Right.
So you can tailor metals by forget what the word is, by mixing in certain tailored isotopes to make them stronger and lighter. We can manufacture medical isotopes for medical imaging and treatment and all sorts of things that people don't tend to think of when you talk about fission and fusion. And so it's not just the electricity, though that's incredibly important, especially at this moment, but it's also gaining mastery over the physical world. And I think that's just so exciting.
I wanted to add there because I was thinking about the Tennessee Valley Authority and the incredible poverty of this region with malaria and illiteracy and just misery. And LaRouche's idea of platform as opposed to infrastructure per se, because what you're talking about is elevating the whole platform of your economy and your society. And what happened in a place like this where suddenly everyone had electricity, you might say, oh, well, I can live in the dark and read at night or something. No, it changes everything. If you are able to throw your laundry in a washing machine and not have to spend hours doing it by hand, what else are you able to do? If you're able to read a book after 7:00 p.m. because you have electric light, if you are able to have your hen house regulated in terms of the light cycles and you can get the chickens to lay more eggs, it changes. And then refrigeration, what does that do for storage of food? Suddenly you are finding that your resources, which Parson Malthus of the British East India Company said were limited, population grows exponentially, resources only grow arithmetically, and therefore we're going to be overpopulated and probably should engage in cannibalism as quickly as possible. What you see is that actually by this type of breakthrough, which transforms the entire platform, your resources, like you might say, well, we didn't even grow more food, but the fact that we could refrigerate it and freeze it meant that we had 3 times the food available that we had before. And I think this, so that if we were to get to a fusion platform where you only need a few grams of fuel to generate massive amounts of very, very high heat, of intense energy, there are things that our entire lives would be completely changed in ways that we can't even imagine at the moment.
The other thing is it would revolutionize space travel. As Lyndon LaRouche said in 1988 with his Woman on Mars video, if we develop a fusion rocket with enough power, he was talking about 1 trillion watts just on the rocket. We could travel to Mars not in 6 months, not in 3 months, but in a matter of days. And once we get there with that power plant, we can do something useful instead of trying to recreate methane like what Elon Musk has talked about, going to Mars with methane and oxygen chemical rockets, which it's time that we graduate from beyond chemical rockets to fusion rockets.
Yeah.
I think that's a great example because when we do that, you're bending time and space. You're changing time and space. I mean, that's really what we're acting on. You're reshaping the physical universe. You completely change the meaning of these things. You reorganize, you reshape the curvature of the physical universe and what we're able to act on and the kind of anti-entropy we can bring to these places.
Exactly.
And for all those animal lovers out there, eventually our sun is going to run out of hydrogen in the core and it's going to start burning helium, but it's not as efficient. It has to have almost 10 times the heat in the center. So it will begin to expand, and we're going to have to find some place to live beyond Earth. And it's not just because of global warming. So what are the whales going to do? What are the cats and dogs going to do? They don't have a space program, so they're depending on us to make sure that life continues even after our sun outlives its natural life.
Yes, that's a very good point. And I know there's a lot of animal lovers out there who would like to make sure we can get them on the space ark to get to the next planet or the next galaxy, actually, or at least another solar system in this galaxy. So, well, I think we can wrap up shortly here, but what closing thoughts do you have, Megan first and then Joel?
I just want to come back to this idea of ending poverty forever. I mean, that was our idea in the 1950s and 60s, that we can that we can close that chapter of humankind as part of our childlike past. And I think a lot of people can't fathom that idea, that there's no need ever in the infinite future of mankind to have poverty. We could do that in a couple of decades. It's not some far off dream. We know how to do it, but you have to have a commitment to these kinds of the application of these kinds of powers like fission, nuclear fission, and then very quickly nuclear fusion being brought online. And then along with that, as we said, the international collaboration. If we brought together the powers of these scientists and engineers from all of these countries around the world and developed in universities in places that people might not think of as being centers of fusion power, countries in Africa, countries in the currently developing world, we could very, very quickly make this breakthrough. And, Joel in the beginning went through how much progress has been made in such a short time. So I would just say that people, I think, have to take that into their minds as a passionate mission, that if this is possible, we have to make it happen.
Thank you. Joel?
Well, the other thing is that if the United States wanted to improve its reputation, it can do what I had recommended when I was running for Congress, is that the U.S. should commit with China and Russia to give one of the first fusion reactors to a country like Haiti, which instead of reparations, why don't we give these countries the technology to leapfrog into the 21st, if not the 22nd century? And that would generate more allies and more friends than any missiles or gadgets that we give the Ukrainians so they can continue to commit suicide.
I think you're right. Certainly killing people off doesn't generate more friends, it generates less. And especially if they are your friends or they think that you're friends, it's one way to get rid of them. So I really want to thank both of you. I think this is a much needed discussion. Mankind has to extricate itself from the morass that we are currently in. And I would like to also remind everyone that coming up this Thursday is the 4th of July, Independence Day. It's the day that the United States of America declared its independence from the British Empire. But unfortunately, we have become the British Empire. We are acting in tandem with them. We have violated virtually every principle on which we were founded. And as it occurred to me today, in our Declaration of Independence, it says self-evident. These truths are self-evident. And I thought, nowadays, people don't act like it's self-evident at all that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the creator. We're endowed with certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That may have been self-evident. It should be self-evident. But the way it becomes evident is when you consider what the human mind is capable of. And when you begin to contemplate where mankind can go and at what amazingly quick rate that we can transform our own mode of existence, you begin to realize why our republic was so necessary, why the revolution against the British Empire was a turning point. And I believe that while we have enormous, wonderful progress with the BRICS nations and a shift, I think there is a spark from the American Revolution that really has to be brought to bear on this. And that spark, as Lynn used to say, it's in your bones. As an American, it's in your bones. So we need that. We need it this weekend. I would encourage everybody to get out your Declaration of Independence and read it, and then pick up some of the writings, as I did today, of people like John Quincy Adams, who gave an incredible address on the 4th of July, 1821. And I just have to issue a complaint. We have come so far that it took me a long time to find online the entire speech. Everyone insists on giving arbitrary snippets of it, so you don't get the whole thing, which again is the sorry state of education in the United States today. So we have a lot of work to do, but I think the discussion tonight really helped us in that regard. So I hope people have a wonderful 4th of July. If you are in the state of New York, go to my website, sarahforsenate.com. I'm writing a statement for the 4th of July to be circulated in thousands of copies all over the state. We want you to go to your parade, your barbecue, your whatever it is, farmer's market, everything going on in your town, and get this out. And let's see if we can get our nation moving in the right direction. So thanks a lot, and I'll see everybody next week.